It was the fall of 2013 when the neighborhood of Westwood Hills, tucked quietly on the outskirts of Los Angeles, began to feel the first signs of unease. The trees, their leaves turning golden and crimson, painted the streets in a light that seemed serene at first glance, but behind the beauty, something dark and unspoken was quietly festering. Rami Al-Fayed had arrived in America 5 years earlier, in 2008, carrying nothing but the heavy weight of his past. Born into turmoil in Beirut, where the distant echoes of war shaped his childhood, Rami came to the U.S. with a dream of starting over, leaving behind the ruins of his former life. Los Angeles seemed like a world away from the rubble of Beirut, a place of promise and opportunity. Yet, despite the bright lights and endless possibilities, Rami's new life had been nothing but silent isolation. As a gardener in Westwood Hills, Rami's days were filled with work in the sun-soaked yards of the wealthy. His hands were deft and patient, tending to flower beds and hedges with a quiet reverence. It was the kind of meticulous labor that allowed him to forget, if only for a moment, the life he had left behind. His presence was often unnoticed, blending in like the subtle scent of jasmine in the evening air. He was the background to the grand mansions, a fixture that brought no attention, just quiet efficiency. But there was one home that, unknowingly, would change everything. Elena Turner lived in one of those grand houses, a woman of striking beauty and grace, yet hollow within. At 33, she had long since exchanged her independence for a life of luxury and comfort with her husband, Victor. On the surface, they were the epitome of success, high-profile, wealthy, and admired by their peers. But beneath the polished exterior, Elena was lost. Her marriage to Victor had long since become a cold, mechanical routine. Their love, if it had ever existed, was buried beneath his constant demands and his unrelenting ambition. He was a man consumed by his work, leaving Elena to fill her days with the hollow distractions of society events and private gatherings that did nothing to ease the gnawing emptiness in her heart. She found herself drawn to the garden. It wasn't the beauty of the flowers, or the symmetry of the meticulously arranged hedges. It was something about Rami's stillness, the way he worked with such focus and precision, as if the garden was his sanctuary. When she first noticed him, she didn't know why, but something in her stirred. It wasn't a romantic notion at first. Rather, it was the allure of simplicity, of a man so at peace with his work, so in tune with his surroundings, that it made her feel small in comparison. She began watching him from the window in the afternoons, her gaze lingering longer than it should have. At first, Rami didn't notice her watching. But over time, he began to feel her presence, the slight shift in the air when she appeared at the window. Her gaze was soft, almost searching, and it unsettled him. Yet, despite the quiet tension that grew between them, he remained respectful, knowing the boundaries that divided their worlds. She, the wealthy wife, he, the hired gardener. The distance between them was vast, impossible to cross. But in the silence, their unspoken connection began to take root, a delicate thread that neither of them fully understood. One afternoon, as the cool breeze of autumn began to settle in, Elena ventured out into the garden under the pretense of admiring the flowers. She didn't know why she had chosen that moment, but it felt like a turning point, a step into something unfamiliar. She approached Rami, her steps tentative, as if unsure of what she was doing. The garden, which had once been a place of calm for her, now felt like a stage for something deeper, something she hadn't expected to find. As she spoke to him, about the flowers, about the weather, there was a strange comfort in their exchange, something simple and unencumbered by the weight of their lives outside that moment. For Rami, the encounter was both unsettling and intriguing. Elena's presence had become impossible to ignore. He had learned to read her subtle expressions, the way her eyes held a sadness, a longing that mirrored his own. And for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to wonder if something more could come from this. It was a dangerous thought, one he quickly pushed away. But deep down, a quiet part of him wondered if there was a way out of the isolation he had lived with for so long. And so, it began. The most delicate of threads had been woven between them, one that would soon unravel in ways neither of them could foresee. The allure of the forbidden was always stronger than reason, and in the silence of Westwood Hills, a tragedy was quietly taking shape. This sets the stage for the complex relationships, tensions, and the underlying conflict that will unfold throughout the story. The description of Rami's quiet, isolated life juxtaposed with Elena's yearning for something more forms the foundation of their eventual, dangerous connection. As the days grew shorter and the chill of fall settled deeper into the bones of Los Angeles, Rami and Elena's interactions became more frequent, though still fleeting. What had started as casual pleasantries exchanged over the delicate care of roses and lilies began to take on a different tone, charged with an undercurrent of something unspoken but undeniable. It was a moment in the early weeks of November when Elena found herself, once again, standing at the edge of the garden, staring out at the labyrinth of greenery. Rami was kneeling in front of a bed of chrysanthemums, carefully pruning the plants with an attention to detail that captivated her. His back was turned, but Elena couldn't shake the feeling that he knew she was there, watching him from the gate of the yard. At first, Elena had told herself it was nothing more than idle curiosity, a distraction from the emptiness of her life. But the more she watched him, the more she found herself drawn to his quiet strength, the way he moved with such purpose and intent. He was a man of few words, but in those rare moments when their gazes met, there was an intensity that spoke volumes. There was no escaping it anymore, she was captivated by him. Rami, on the other hand, was caught in the same tide, though he tried harder to keep his distance. He knew the boundaries. He was acutely aware of the line between them, a line drawn by class, by circumstance, by the simple fact that he was nothing more than a gardener in the grand scheme of her world. Yet, there was something about her, something that drew him in despite himself. When Elena was near, he felt a warmth that had been absent for years, a connection that sparked something deep inside him. It was a feeling he couldn't quite name but knew was dangerous to entertain. One afternoon, just as the sun began to set, painting the sky with fiery oranges and purples, Elena ventured deeper into the garden than she ever had before. She was alone, leaving behind the noise and expectations of her home, seeking solace in the quiet beauty of Rami's work. She lingered by a small fountain where Rami had placed delicate stone sculptures, each positioned carefully to capture the light just so. When Rami saw her standing by the fountain, her gaze distant, he approached slowly, his heart beating faster than usual. He had been avoiding her, but something about her presence now felt almost urgent, like a pull he couldn't ignore. "You like the fountain?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Elena looked up at him, startled, as though she hadn't expected him to be so close. But when their eyes met, she didn't pull away. Instead, she gave a small smile, one that was equal parts sadness and something else, something far more complex. "It's beautiful. You've done an amazing job with everything," she said, her voice soft, her words tinged with an emotion Rami couldn't quite place. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence heavy between them. The tension, once subtle, now hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. "Rami," she whispered after a long pause. "I feel like I'm suffocating sometimes. Like I'm trapped in a life that isn't mine. I don't know how to escape it." Rami's chest tightened at her words. He had sensed her loneliness, her longing, but hearing it spoken aloud made it all the more real. He felt a pang of something in his chest, a mixture of sympathy and something darker, something he didn't want to admit. "You don't need to escape," he said quietly, trying to keep the distance between them. "You just need to live. To live for yourself." Elena turned to him fully now, her expression serious, her eyes searching his face for something. There was no going back, she knew it. They were standing on the precipice of something neither could undo. She took a step closer, the air between them charged with something electric, something inevitable. "I don't know how to do that anymore," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everything I do feels wrong. I don't know who I am anymore." Rami could feel her pain, it resonated in his bones, and for a moment, he forgot about the lines that separated them. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them until they were standing face to face. The space between them felt impossibly small, yet the weight of their circumstances was like an immovable barrier. "I can't change your life," Rami said, his voice raw with emotion. "But maybe you can find something real here. Even if it's only for a moment." Elena's breath caught in her throat. There it was, the unspoken invitation, a slip into the dangerous unknown. The pull between them was undeniable. And in that moment, everything else, their lives, their marriages, their worlds, faded away. What remained was the connection between them, raw and exposed. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through both of them. And for a fleeting second, they both forgot about the boundaries they had once carefully placed. In that brief touch, they both felt the stirrings of something dangerous, something deeper than either could fully understand. But just as quickly as it had come, Elena pulled her hand back. The moment passed, leaving behind a tension that neither could ignore. Her mind raced, and she felt the weight of guilt and fear begin to settle in. She couldn't do this. Not like this. I should go, she muttered, her voice trembling slightly. Rami nodded, his heart sinking as he watched her retreat, her figure slowly fading into the distance. He knew that something had changed. The thread that had been tugged between them had grown tighter, and there was no unraveling it now. The consequences of what had just transpired would soon become clear. That night, as the stars filled the sky, both Elena and Rami lay awake in their separate worlds, haunted by the same thought: what would happen now? And how far would they go to find the answers to the questions neither of them dared to ask aloud? In this section, the relationship between Rami and Elena evolves from mere curiosity to emotional complexity. The tension builds as they confront their desires, with Elena admitting her dissatisfaction with her life and Rami's inner conflict growing. Their connection deepens, setting the stage for the unexpected twists that will follow. The days following that fateful afternoon in the garden were filled with a quiet, unspoken tension that seemed to hang in the air like a storm cloud waiting to burst. Rami and Elena, though their worlds had collided in that brief moment of connection, had retreated into their respective silences. The distance between them was palpable, but the thoughts of each other lingered, impossible to erase. Elena found herself torn in a way she never had before. The guilt that had always been a quiet companion now roared in her mind. She had made a mistake. She had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. And yet, at the same time, there was a strange yearning inside her, a feeling of being seen by Rami in a way her husband, Victor, never had. It wasn't love, she told herself. It couldn't be. But there was something undeniable between them, something that had shattered the fragile peace she had once found in her perfect life. The lie she had lived for so long, pretending to be happy, pretending to be fulfilled, now seemed unbearable. Victor, oblivious to the deepening chasm between them, continued his daily routines as if nothing had changed. His work consumed him, endless meetings, conference calls, and business deals that kept him away from home for days at a time. His absence, Elena realized, had been the catalyst for everything that had happened. She had wanted attention, validation, but had received none. And so, she had turned to Rami. Yet, it wasn't just Victor's neglect that had driven her to Rami. It was the deep, aching loneliness she had buried for years. And now, as she sat in the vast, empty house, the silence suffocating her, she wondered if there was any way back to who she was before her marriage had become a lie. Was there even a part of her that could still be whole again? Or had she already given away too much? The tension in the air grew heavier as the days passed. Elena tried to push Rami from her mind, but his image remained, lingering like a shadow in every corner of her life. She could no longer pretend that she didn't feel something for him. And when she finally gave in to the need to see him again, she found herself standing in front of the gate to his modest apartment just outside the city lights flickering in the distance. Rami, too, was at war with himself. The simple life he had carved out for himself, working in the gardens of wealthy homes and keeping to the shadows, had been disrupted in ways he never could have imagined. He had thought he could keep his distance from Elena, but every time she looked at him, with those wide, searching eyes, he felt a tug at his heart. It was dangerous, he knew. He couldn't allow himself to feel this way. But it wasn't just attraction, it was something deeper. A need to protect her, to be there for her in a way no one else could. She was a woman drowning in a life she didn't want, and he, with all his own scars, wanted to be the lifeline that could pull her out. But that was the problem. He knew he couldn't be. They were from two different worlds. And no matter how much he cared, he could never be the man she needed. It was a week later, just as the last rays of the setting sun cast long shadows over the garden, when everything came to a head. Victor had returned unexpectedly early from a business trip, his mood foul and impatient. Elena had tried to hide her anxiety, but it was impossible. The unease between them was now too thick to ignore. He had begun to ask more questions, questions she wasn't prepared to answer. And when he found a piece of jewelry, a bracelet, beneath a pile of clothes in their bedroom, the silence between them shattered. "What's this?" he demanded, his voice cold, demanding an answer. Elena froze. She had hoped that Victor would never find it, but now there was no hiding it. The bracelet was a gift Rami had given her on the afternoon she had finally confided in him about her loneliness, her yearning for something more. It was meant to be a symbol of connection, of the bond that had been forged in the most unexpected of circumstances. But now it was a symbol of betrayal. Victor's face turned ashen as he stared at the bracelet, his eyes widening in realization. His hands clenched at his sides, and for a moment, Elena feared he might lash out. The silence that followed was thick with rage, and Elena could feel the walls of her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. "Who is he?" Victor asked, his voice barely above a whisper, but the fury in his tone was unmistakable. Elena couldn't speak. She opened her mouth, but the words wouldn't come. How could she explain the connection she had with Rami, a connection that defied logic, defied her marriage, and defied everything she had ever known? How could she explain the feelings that had grown between them, feelings that threatened to consume her? Meanwhile, Rami was in the garden, working on the last of the flower beds as the sun began to dip below the horizon. He could sense something had changed. The atmosphere felt heavy, the quiet too suffocating. As he looked up from his work, he saw Victor standing at the gate, his face twisted in anger. It was a confrontation Rami had been dreading. Victor stepped forward, his fists clenched, his eyes locked on Rami with a cold fury. There was no room for words, no room for explanation. The raw emotion between them exploded in an instant. Victor lunged, throwing a punch that landed squarely on Rami's jaw. Rami staggered back, pain shooting through his face, but he didn't retaliate. He knew better. This wasn't his fight. But as Victor swung again, Rami's instinct to defend himself kicked in. The struggle was brief, but intense, with both men grappling in the quiet garden, their emotions fueling every movement. But just as quickly as the fight had erupted, it ended. Rami, bloodied but not broken, managed to break free and flee the scene, leaving Victor standing in the middle of the garden, seething with fury. As he ran into the distance, Rami's mind raced. He could feel his world crumbling around him. The tangled emotions between him and Elena had led to this moment, and there was no going back. Neither of them could return to what they had before. The lies, the deception, the betrayal, it had all led to this point. And as Victor stood silently, his chest heaving with rage, he too realized something he had been unwilling to face for so long: his marriage to Elena was no longer a facade. It was a battlefield. This section builds on the emotional and psychological conflicts between the characters. As Elena is caught between guilt and desire, and Rami is torn between his feelings and his sense of responsibility, the tension between them finally erupts in a confrontation with Victor. This marks the beginning of the collapse of their relationships, setting the stage for the tragic events to follow. The days after the confrontation in the garden were filled with a strange kind of silence. The violence of the fight between Rami and Victor seemed to hang in the air, suffocating everything around it. But even as the dust settled, the emotional chaos remained. Rami, bruised and battered, had disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind only whispers of what had transpired. His absence sent ripples through the lives of those left behind, yet the storm was far from over. Elena, though racked with guilt, couldn't bring herself to confront Victor about what had happened. The truth hung between them, suffocating them both, but she was too afraid to speak it aloud. Her heart was torn between the two men, the one she had married and the one she had betrayed him with. Rami's face, bloodied and vulnerable, haunted her thoughts. She knew, deep down, that this was not a momentary mistake, a fleeting affair. It was something much deeper, something that could never be undone. As the days wore on, the reality of the situation became clearer. Victor was no longer the same. The calm, calculated man she had married was now replaced by someone unpredictable, consumed by jealousy and rage. Every word he spoke, every glance he cast, seemed laced with suspicion. The warmth that had once held their marriage together was now a cold, distant void, and Elena could feel herself slipping further away. She knew Rami was somewhere, hiding from Victor's wrath, but where? The thought of him, alone, afraid, broken, gnawed at her. She had to find him. She had to apologize. But the consequences of her actions were closing in, and time was running out. Then, it happened. On the morning of November 12, 2014, just after dawn had broken over the city, a discovery was made. A local dog walker, a middle-aged man who had taken the same route through the woods just outside Westwood Hills every morning, stumbled upon Rami's lifeless body. His face was bruised and swollen, the skin around his neck showing clear signs of strangulation. There were no signs of struggle, it was as if he had been ambushed, taken by surprise, his life snatched away in the quiet hours before the world awoke. The news spread quickly through the community, shocking everyone. Rami, the quiet gardener who had tended to their homes, who had become a fixture in their neighborhood, was dead. His tragic end was nothing less than a brutal reminder of how quickly things could spiral out of control, how fragile their worlds truly were. As the police arrived at the scene, they began their investigation methodically. The coroner's report confirmed what the community already feared: Rami had been murdered. His injuries suggested a violent confrontation, but there were no clear suspects. No one had seen or heard anything out of the ordinary in the neighborhood, and Rami's life, until now, had been largely invisible. The detectives began by questioning those closest to him, hoping to find some clue that might point to a motive. Elena, consumed by guilt and fear, was summoned for questioning. Her heart pounded in her chest as she walked into the police station, her every movement under scrutiny. She was terrified of what they might uncover, terrified of the way her life was now unraveling. "What was your relationship with Rami?" Detective Samuel Ross asked, his voice calm but his eyes sharp, sensing the discomfort radiating from her. Elena hesitated, her mind racing. She knew the detective could see through her. The questions about her and Rami's connection had already started to surface in the neighborhood. The affair was no longer a secret. "He was just the gardener," she said, her voice trembling. I barely knew him." But her words fell flat, and Detective Ross didn't buy it. The bracelet that Victor had found, the secret meetings in the garden, all of it came rushing back to her in a flood of shame. She wanted to scream, to tell the truth, but she couldn't. The fear of destroying everything that was left of her life kept her silent. As the investigation continued, a breakthrough came in the form of a witness. A neighbor, who had been walking his dog that same morning, claimed to have seen Victor leaving the vicinity of the woods shortly after dawn. His account, though not conclusive, raised enough suspicion to warrant further investigation. Elena, in the days that followed, became a person of interest. Her name, once associated with the luxury and prestige of the Turner family, was now tangled in the web of scandal and tragedy. Rumors of the affair with Rami began to spread like wildfire, and the once admired Turners became the talk of the neighborhood. Elena's social circle, once a source of validation, now turned its back on her. Victor, however, remained silent. His anger simmered beneath the surface, but he never gave the police a clear answer. His denial only fueled suspicions, and the detectives' questioning grew more intense. The real breakthrough came when forensic evidence tied the bracelet Elena had worn to the crime scene. It was found near Rami's body, buried in the dirt as if someone had tried to hide it. The evidence was undeniable. With the mounting evidence against her, Elena finally cracked under the pressure. She confessed to having an affair with Rami, but she claimed that she had no knowledge of his murder. Still, the pieces of the puzzle fell into place: Victor's jealousy, his rage, his suspicion. The investigators began to connect the dots. It was clear now that Victor had found out about the affair, and in a fit of uncontrollable rage, he had sought out Rami, ending his life in a brutal act of violence. The arrest came swiftly. Victor Turner, once a respected businessman, was now behind bars, charged with the murder of Rami Al-Fayed. The consequences were catastrophic. The Turners' lives, once filled with wealth and success, were now shattered. Elena was left to pick up the pieces, but there was nothing left to salvage. The guilt that had gnawed at her since that first touch in the garden now consumed her completely. Rami's death was the price they had all paid for the lies, the deceit, and the brokenness of their lives. As for Rami, his story ended tragically, his life stolen in the prime of it, all because of a love he had never fully embraced. In the wake of his death, the quiet garden he once tended stood as a haunting reminder of the price of passion left unchecked, of the consequences that come when the truth is buried too deeply. This section intensifies the tragic consequences of the affair and the murder. Elena is drawn further into the investigation as guilt and fear consume her, while Victor's jealousy and rage spiral into a devastating act of violence. The fallout from Rami's death is catastrophic, and his life, once full of quiet potential, ends violently, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. The events that unfolded in Westwood Hills had rippled far beyond the well-manicured lawns and grand homes of the affluent neighborhood. The tragedy of Rami's death and the unraveling of Elena and Victor Turner's marriage became a spectacle in the community, reflecting the complexities of modern American society, where wealth, ambition, and emotional isolation often collide in the most unexpected ways. Los Angeles, with its glamorous image, often hides the cracks beneath the surface, cracks in relationships, in personal fulfillment, and in the pursuit of happiness. Rami, the humble gardener, was a man from a different world. He had arrived in the U.S. seeking a new beginning, far from the violence of Beirut, and yet he found himself tangled in the web of a family's brokenness. His life was quietly interrupted by the passions of a woman who, despite her wealth and privilege, was equally lost in a society that valued appearances over emotional depth. Elena's predicament is one many in today's society can relate to. She had everything on the outside: luxury, status, and a comfortable life, but her emotional needs were ignored. In the culture of the American upper class, where wealth often becomes a shield against true intimacy, Elena's loneliness went unnoticed for years. The pressures to maintain a perfect image, to present a picture of success and happiness, became a prison. This was the hidden cost of success, the emotional toll of living in a world where image often outweighs reality. Victor, a successful businessman, embodied the pursuit of the American dream in its most traditional sense. He was driven, competitive, and consumed by his career. But like many in the upper echelons of society, he had neglected his own emotional needs and the emotional needs of his wife. His blind ambition had driven a wedge between him and Elena, leaving her to seek connection and affection elsewhere. Victor's inability to connect emotionally, to see the cracks forming in his marriage, was a reflection of a broader issue in American society, the often toxic culture of workaholism and the undervaluing of personal relationships. The affair between Elena and Rami revealed something even more profound about the complexities of modern relationships. In the quest for fulfillment, people often look for validation outside their relationships, seeking something they feel is missing. Elena's connection with Rami, though filled with passion and secrecy, was ultimately a desperate search for something real, a genuine emotional bond. But in doing so, she ignored the consequences of breaking trust, of betraying not only Victor but herself. The tragedy that followed Rami's death is a harsh reminder of the dangers of neglecting emotional needs in a world obsessed with success and appearance. It shows the price that people pay when they live lives of quiet desperation, hiding their pain behind a mask of perfection. In the end, it is the personal connections, the ability to be vulnerable, to love and be loved, that bring meaning to life, not wealth, status, or power. Victor's rage, fueled by jealousy and a deep sense of betrayal, turned fatal, highlighting the darker side of the American psyche. His failure to address his emotional disconnect led to an irreversible act of violence. His actions and their consequences point to a larger societal issue, the inability of many to confront their feelings and the dangerous, sometimes tragic, consequences that follow when emotions are repressed. The tragedy of Rami, a man who came to America to escape violence, only to be caught in a web of love, betrayal, and destruction, is a reflection of a larger cultural story in America, one where people are often torn between their pursuit of success and the deeper, often unspoken needs for connection, authenticity, and emotional health. What do you think of this story? Was it love that led to Rami's tragic end, or was it something darker? Can we truly escape the chains of our own desires and societal expectations, or are we doomed to repeat the same mistakes? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think Elena and Victor could have saved their marriage? Or was the fallout inevitable from the start? What does this story say about the pressures of modern life and the human need for genuine connection? Leave a comment below and share your opinions with us. Let's start a conversation. What do you think is the true cost of pursuing the perfect life in today's society? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more thought-provoking stories like this one. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. This section ties the story back to broader social themes, connecting Elena and Victor's relationship issues, Rami's tragic fate, and the cultural context of modern American society. It explores how success, isolation, emotional neglect, and the pressures to maintain appearances contribute to the downfall of the characters, while also encouraging viewers to reflect and engage with the story.